Good evening, welcome. Thank you so much for joining. Questions have a sort of controversial history, at least as far as the secular world goes. The history of asking questions begins with Socrates, who was essentially jailed and executed on account of his questions. Questions were central to his mission of developing an educational method that focused on discovering answers by asking questions from his students. And to this day, persistent questioning in search of clarity is known as the Socratic method. For this habit, among other things, he was put on trial by the Athenians, accused of corrupting the youth, and was sentenced to death. Fast forward from the 5th century BCE to this last summer, when a young woman posted a video on TikTok, a video sharing platform that many of you may be familiar with. She posted a video in which she questioned the origins of algebra and whether math is real. And she did this while casually applying her makeup. This video went viral when someone else shared it with the caption, "Dumbest video I've ever seen." This young woman's questions about math, which she delivered a little bit flippantly, were widely mocked, and she was viciously ridiculed over social media. But then others started coming to her defense, particularly mathematicians and other thinkers who pointed out that the questions she was asking were indeed very important fundamental questions that scholars of math are still debating. Clearly, certain questions can be quite triggering for some people. For us as Jews, however, the story of questions cannot be more different. We are at home with questions, and anyone with a Jewish education knows the central role that questions play in Jewish life and learning. Indeed, there is a Jewish stereotype, and I don't like to talk about stereotypes, but there's a Jewish stereotype, one that I believe is somewhat well-earned, that Jews often answer questions with questions. Someone once asked the advice columnist, Dear Abby, who was Jewish, "Why do Jews always answer a question with a question?" To which she responded, "How should they answer?" In our long tradition of asking questions that starts in the Torah and reaches one of its fullest expressions in the Talmud, the Seder night stands out. The Pesach Seder is one of the climactic moments of the year, and one of the critical junctures at the Seder is the asking of questions, the Manishtana, the 4 questions. But questions appear in a number of other places in the Seder. We're going to look at the Manishtana, and we're going to look at these other instances as well, and we will study this evening why there is such an obsession with questions at the Seder. What is the nature of this unique phenomenon in the course of Jewish study? As we turn our attention to the classical sources from Torah and Chazal, I hope to demonstrate that questions aren't just a means to get answers. They aren't just a tool to enable something more important. We don't just use questions to tell the story of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. No. Instead, we have a distinct obligation to ask questions, separate and apart from telling the story, from the obligation to tell the story. Questions have an independent significance as questions. And B, we can learn as much from the questions as we do from the answers, and this is reflected in the Haggadah and beyond. And so our talk this evening will be in 2 parts. A, exploring the nature of this obligation to ask questions, and then B, what can we learn? What can we learn from the enterprise of asking questions? So let's begin. And I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen so that we can look at the sources together. What we'll see first is the very strong emphasis on questions in the Haggadah. The questions of the Manishtana, which is right in front of you at this point in source number 2, initiate or kick off the long Magid section of the Haggadah. But if you look carefully, you'll notice that questions appear in two other important places as well, in addition to the Manishtana. Here is source number 3, the Arba Banim, the 4 children. 3 of them ask a question, the Chacham, the Rasha, and the Tam. And one of them is identified by the very fact that he cannot ask a question. V'she'eno yodea lishol. Now this is interesting to me, because we could have described him in any other way. We could have described him as a toddler, as someone who hasn't learned yet, someone who hasn't gone to school yet, but no. He is defined specifically by his capacity or incapacity to participate in the act of asking questions. Again, the other sons are defined by their character and what type of question they are able to ask. But this one, the She'enu de Elishol, is defined specifically based on his capacity to question, not his capacity to understand the story or to understand God or the mitzvos of the night, but specifically his capacity to ask. And so I submit that the Arba Banim, the 4 children, that title is really a misnomer, because I really believe this should be called the 4 questioners. Because you see from the She'enu de Elishol, it's really all about their ability or inability to ask questions. That's what's most important about them. Look at source number 4. Later on in Magid, Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel haya omer kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu ba'pesach lo yatsi yadei chovaso. Rabbi Gamliel is trying to teach us what we have to say at the Seder in order to fulfill our obligation to tell the story. And so you would think he would focus exclusively on what exactly we have to say in order to fulfill that mitzvah. And yet he introduces each one with a question. He doesn't just say Pesach al shum shepasach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He doesn't just say Matzah al shum shelo hispik b'tzeikam. No. Instead, he says, Pesach shayu avosenu ochlim bizman shveis hamikdash hayakayam al shuma. For what reason? For the sake of what do we have it? Al shum shepasach. Matzah zushanu ochlim al shuma. For what do we have it? Al shum shelo hispik b'tzeikam. And the same thing for maror. But introducing each one of these concepts with a question is completely unnecessary. If his goal was to teach us how to fulfill the mitzvah, then just say, you have to say Pesach al shum shepasach. You have to say Matzah al shum shelo hispik b'tzeikam. You have to say maror al shum shemeru. But why introduce each one with a question that's not really necessary? So what's interesting then, what you see clearly, is that in Rabbi Gamliel's attempt to encapsulate how to fulfill Magid, he makes sure to include questions. Should also be noted, in addition to these 3 instances now of Manishtana, the Arba Banim, and Rabbi Gamliel, all of which center on the fact that there are questions to be asked. In addition to that, think about how we end the Seder. We have a selection of these songs, these poems that are a lot of fun to sing, and each family has their own tunes. And what's interesting is that one of those songs goes through all the basic tenets of belief, all the important things to know about Judaism. One is Hashem, 2 are the Luchos, 3 are the Avos, and the song itself also is done specifically, unnecessarily, through question and answer. Echad mi yodea, echad ani yodea. Again, carrying this idea, this feeling, this great deal of focus on questions. Now, aside from these specific instances that I've listed so far, the Manishtana, the Arba Banim, and Rabbi Gamliel, these instances of questions found in the text of the Haggadah, we know very well that there are another 5 separate customs at the Seder that are meant strictly to catch the attention of the children, to arouse the curiosity of the children and inspire them to ask questions on their own. Urchatz, we're told by the rabbis, is to get the children to ask, dipping the karpas, splitting the middle matzah, yachatz, removing the table, akiras hashulchan, 5, and even pouring the second cup of wine, mazgulo kos sheni, the second cup of wine, also the rabbis say is meant to elicit questions from the children. So we have questions at all these critical junctures in Magid. We have all these instances in which we are eliciting, we are instigating, we want to inspire kids to ask questions at the Seder. How do we understand this obsession with questions that appear throughout the Haggadah? So let's look back at where these questions come from originally. Let's look back at the earliest sources in the Torah. These 4 psukim are essentially the only 4 psukim that teach us, that command us to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. The mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim emerges from these 4 psukim. This is the origin of the mitzvah. And each one of them involves, number 1, children, and 3 out of 4 explicitly convey the mitzvah of telling the story as being an answer to a question. Source number 5. What is this avoda? What is this service? That's from Shmos Yud Beis. Source number 6 in Shmos Yud Gimel. Now there's no question in this pasuk, but it's in the same context as the next source, and there's clearly this idea that we are addressing something that the child is inquiring about. Source number 7. Mazos. When your child asks you tomorrow, what is this? And you'll tell him. And finally, source number 8. So in all of these instances, we are addressing questions. The mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is presented specifically as a response to questions that come from our children. And what's interesting, if you take note, is that the questions found in the Torah do not comprise the Manishtana. Right? We don't base this Manishtana in which we want the children to stand up and ask questions at the Seder. They're not the questions that we find in the Torah. The questions that children ask in the Torah are not the questions that the rabbis composed for them at the Seder. Where do we find these questions in the Haggadah? You all know. These questions are put into the mouths of the 4 children who all ask questions. And even the one who doesn't ask a question, Sheinu de Elisho, you respond to that child as if he did. So it's just interesting to me that Chazal in the Mishnah add further questions than the questions that were already found in the Torah. And these are the Manishtana. If you take a look, source number 9, the Gemara Maseches Pesachim Kuf Tez Zayin. Here are the questions that must be asked. Mazgulo kol sheni, they pour the second cup. V'chan haben shoel aviv. And here the child asks their parent. V'mein das b'ven aviv malamdo. And if the child is not able to ask, the parent should teach him. Manishtana halayla zeh mikol halelos. How is this night different, or why is this night different from all other nights? Shebechol halelos, you know the questions. These are the 4 questions. One of them is about the Korban Pesach. We don't have the Korban Pesach anymore. But what do we see? We see that Chazal prescribe specific questions for the children to ask. We give them a script that we want them to ask. Notice, and this is my observation, notice that the Mishnah only prescribes questions for the children to ask. The Mishnah doesn't prescribe any answers or any story for the children specifically to recite. You would think if the ultimate goal of the Seder night is to tell the story, why doesn't the Mishnah spell out what the children should say about the story? It doesn't. It just says that, okay, and then the parents teach them the story however they do it, whatever it is. And I know we have a text. But if you think about it, Chazal gave a script for this evening for the children. This is the project the children bring home from school, prepared by Chazal. And what did Chazal send them home with? Chazal only sent them home with questions. Chazal did not send children home with answers. There's no prescribed answer that the child should get up and read. I'm repeating myself. Okay. Why don't we want them to tell the story? Well, I know we want them to listen to the story. I know we want them to learn the story. But why didn't Chazal go so far as to spell out, okay, children, now we want you to repeat the story. It's only questions we want them to ask. Okay, I'm belaboring. Let's continue. Source number 10. We're now going to see several sources which show that not only do we have a script for the children that is exclusively questions, but we do things differently and strangely in order to elicit questions from them. All these Gemaras are going to be familiar to you. Everyone's obligated in the 4 cups of wine, men, women, and children. All right, you're going to serve alcohol to a minor. We are going to distribute to them roasted grains and nuts, the equivalent of candies. We give them candies be'erev Pesach, kedei shelo yishnu v'yish'alu, so that they should not sleep and so that they should ask. And this was reported about Rabbi Akiva as well. This may be, you might think I'm nitpicking, but I read this Gemara and I said to myself, I understand we want them to get interested. I understand we want them to be awake for the Seder, but why specifically to ask? Why not give them candies so that they stay up to hear the story? Why? The entire focus seems to be exclusively on the children asking, with much less attention to given to whatever the answer is, whatever the story is. We don't say distribute candies so that they stay up to hear the story. It's specifically that they should stay up to ask. Let's look at the next Gemara, source number 11. Lama okrinas hashulchan. Why do we remove the tables? Back then, everyone had their own TV table, and so they want to know, why did you pull away the TV table? This was long before they had Netflix, but they already had TV tables all set and ready to go. That's how they ate. Amri devei Rabbi Yanai kadeshi akiru tunokos v'yishalu, so that they should recognize and they should ask. Abaye have a Yosef kamei de Rabba. Very important story, short story, anecdote that happens. Abaye, as a young child, was sitting before Rabba. Chaza de kamadle taka mikame, and he saw that they were removing the table from before him. Amr lahu, he said to them, Abaye, Adayin lo koachilna achlinan. We haven't eaten yet. Asu kama akre takami kamon, and yet you're taking the table away. We bring the table to eat dinner, and then you pull the table away before we even ate dinner. Oh, Amar le Rabba, pitartan milomar manishtana. The fact that you asked this question, you exempted us from having to ask the manishtana. So two observations. Again, kadesh yakiru tinokos vishalu. The focus is exclusively on them asking. And not only that, but this word pitartan, from the word patur, that's a technical legal term, suggesting that there is an independent obligation to recite Manishtana. It clearly indicates that there is this independent obligation to have questions. That we would say, pitartan, you exempted us from reciting Manishtana. We see something similar in the next Gemara. I'll do it just a little bit quickly. Source number 12. Amar le Rav Nachman ledaru avde. Rav Nachman said to Daru, his servant, Avda demapik le mari lecherus. If a master frees his servant, yahiv le kasav dahaba, and he gives him gold and silver, my boy le, what should he say to him? Amar le baile du le shabuche. He should thank him and praise him for setting him free. Amar le Pitartan milomar manishtana, pasach v'amar abadim hayinu. You exempt us from saying manishtana. He immediately continues with abadim hayinu. Again, this same idea that there seems to be this independent obligation simply to have questions. In the next Gemara, we see what we already know, is that even if there are no children present to ask questions, there still is an obligation. Tana Rabbanon, source number 13, Chacham b'no sho'alo. Right? If a person has a child who is smart enough to ask, that child asks. V'meino Chacham, and if they don't have a child that is able, Ishto sho'alto, then a person's spouse should ask. Lav sho'alato, he should ask himself. Even two wise people, sho'alin zeh lazeh, they ask each other. So after having seen these four Gemaras, these four sources, we see two things so far. That the Psukim and the Gemaras, the obligation of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is presented in the Torah as a response to questions. And these several sources from Chazal insist that questions must be asked as an independent obligation. There is an independent obligation to ask questions. And this idea that there's an independent obligation will help us understand something very strange in the language of the Rambam. It's a fascinating Rambam. Take a look with me, please. It's source number 14. Here, the Rambam in the laws of Chametz Umatzah, when he's going through the different parts of the Seder, so he gets to the point where you're ready to pour the second cup. Umozgin hakos hasheni v'kan habein shoel. So they pour the second cup, and here the child asks, Ve'omer hakore Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylos. The child asks, and then the kore, the leader, the reader, whoever that is, says Manishtana halayla hazeh. Now, a number of commentaries really struggle over this Rambam. Because had we not read this Rambam, it would have said, okay, the children ask Manishtana, and then you go on with Avadim Hayinu. I'm sure that's what goes on in many of your homes. And yet that's not what the Rambam says. The Rambam says that the child asks, and then the leader repeats the Manishtana. Tell me something. You don't have to answer, but just answer in your own minds. What do you do in your house? Does everyone say the Manishtana? Is it just the youngest child? Is it everyone? Is it everyone including the leader? Who says the Manishtana? According to this Rambam, there is an obligation for the leader to repeat the Manishtana. Where does this obligation come from? Or put differently, why does the leader have to repeat Manishtana if the child just said it? That's the question of the Chassam Sofer in source number 15. I'm sorry, it's a little bit blurry. But he says, Lashon HaRambam, Pereches Halacha Beis, V'kana Ben Shol, V'omer HaKori Manishtana V'chulei, Mashma sheHakori HaHaggadah Yomer Manishtana. That the person, the leader, reading the Haggadah says Manishtana. Ubi Gemara, Kuf Tezayin Mashma Im HaBen Shoel, Lo Yomer HaKori El Avadim Hayinu. That if the child already asked, then you just go on with Avadim Hayinu. You don't have to say the Manishtana again. In fact, if you take a look at the Rashbam, he says this explicitly. Source number 16 on the same page. Petartan milomer Manishtana, desanya likaman, chacham beno sholo, vimlav shol hula atzmo Manishtana. Right? Because we learned in that brisa that if a person has a child who can ask the question, they ask, and if not, he asks himself, Manishtana. V'kevan sheshalu lono Manishtana. Once the children ask Manishtana, einon tzrichim lomer Manishtana, elo lahashiv al dvarav. We don't need to say Manishtana. All I have to do is answer. Right? Avadim Hayinu. We just go on with Avadim Hayinu. Now, the Rashbam clearly disagrees with the Rambam. But how do we understand the Rambam? How do we answer the question of the Chassam Sofer on the Rambam? So the Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, has an answer. If you take a look at source number 17 in front of you, I'll read just a little bit of it. If you look at the fourth line, at the end of the line on the right-hand side, V'hayesod l'din zeh nireh, the essence of this is, Ziladas HaRambam hadin lishol belel haseder eino rak midine v'higadat levincha. That the din, the law to ask questions at the night of the Seder, isn't just isn't just a fulfillment of the pasuk of the V'yigarat levincha v'amitzvah lo'odiah levanim, that it's not just part of the mitzvah of teaching your children. This is a foundational element of the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. The hamatbeya shel Sipur leharambam, that the formula, the way you have to tell the story according to the Rambam, hu b'derech shel she'ela v'tshuva. It has to be done in question and answer format. You cannot sit down at the Seder and present the story of the Exodus as a novel, as a story. You can't just sit down and tell the story. It must begin with questions. V'zeh she'omer hakore Manishtana, so the kore reciting, the leader reciting Manishtana, kol zehu mi'ikar chovas haGadol. That's why the Rambam says that the leader has to repeat the Manishtana, because that is the formula of telling the story. You cannot tell the story without asking questions first. And in the second paragraph, the Rav reports that was the opinion and the practice of his grandfather, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, that he would make sure that after the children asked the Manishtana, he would ask the Manishtana. Interestingly, the Ramah, representing Ashkenazic practice, specifically says, like we saw in the Rashbam, that you don't have to repeat Manishtana, arguing on the Rambam. And I'm just going to show you, in source number 18. We're not going to go through it. This is the original source of the Rav's grandfather, Reb Chaim, where he demonstrates this concept that part of what makes Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim as a mitzvah unique at the night of the Seder is the fact that you must do it in question and answer format. You must have questions introducing the story. I just want to show you very quickly how Tosfos argues on the Rambam. Tosfos, source number 19, Kedei sheyakir hatinok v'yishol, klomar, it means to say, umitoch kach, yavo lishol b'shar dvarim. That we do things differently in order that the child should ask on all sorts of things. But the fact that the child sees the table being moved, that was the context of this Gemara, lo yipater mi Manishtana. That does not exempt from Manishtana. The Ahida Abaye, that story of Abaye, the young Abaye sitting before Rabbah, lo pirush haGemara el tchilas she'elaso. When Abaye asked why we were moving the table, the Gemara only gave us the beginning of his questions. But of course, he went on to ask more questions, namely the questions of the Manishtana. So here we see that Tosfos agrees with the Rambam that you have to say Manishtana at the Seder. He just disagrees with the Rambam who has to say it. The Rambam holds everyone, child and adult, have to say Manishtana. Tosfos, however, and this is like the Ramah that we mentioned, Tosfos say no. One person can say the Manishtana. It can be the child, it can be the parent, but somebody has to say it. It cannot be skipped. You cannot say, or you cannot ask, why is this table being moved, and then go to Avadim Hayinu. You need the Manishtana. And I'll just show you quickly also two other Rishonim, the Shibbolei Haleket, who was an Italian Rishon, and the Rokeach, who was a Rishon in Germany. They're even more Mako. They're the ones who hold that even if they read the Gemara literally, that even if you just ask any random question about something that's strange about the night, why is the table being moved? You're completely exempt. You don't even need to say Manishtana. But even according to this opinion that says you can skip the Manishtana if there is a question, even they agree that you need some kind of question to replace it. So according to the Rambam, according to Tosfos, and according to these two Rishonim, also the Shibbolei Haleket and the Rokeach, they all agree you need a question. Rambam holds everyone needs to say the Manishtana. Tosfos says someone has to say the Manishtana, and Shibbolei Haleket and the Rokeach says you need a question, but it doesn't have to be the Manishtana. This obligation, this independent obligation to have questions, is reflected in some extreme opinions, and I describe them as extreme because they're gonna knock your socks off. The Rush, and I'm not going to read most of these sources because the language is a little bit technical and I don't want to get bogged down. But that first source, 22, the Rush was asked why we don't make a bracha on the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. We make a bracha on many mitzvos. Why not the bracha of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim? You know what he says, and this is explained by Rabbi Yerucham Perlo in source 23. The reason why we don't have a bracha is because you might not fulfill it midoraisa. The Rush says that it's only a biblical mandate to tell the story if a child asks. Because that's the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Vayak yishal chabin chalemor," right? When your child asks. And so the Rush has a startling opinion. You only fulfill the mitzvah from the Torah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim if a child asks. If nobody asks any questions, you have no obligation to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. An astounding opinion from the Rush, as explained by Rabbi Perlo. The rabbis came along and said, Midrabanan, even if nobody asks, you still have to tell the story, but that's only Midrabanan. But Midoraisa, there's no obligation if you don't have someone asking. This is an extreme indication, this sort of lone opinion of how seriously we take this obligation, this necessary requirement for questions at the Seder. Tosfos, source number 24. Again, I'm not going to read it inside. You'll forgive me, but the language is a little bit technical. But what Tosfos essentially says, you're not going to believe this. He's addressing the situation. The Gemara discusses, what if you only have one vegetable? Should you use it for karpas or should you use it for maror? You only have chazeres. You only have one piece of chazeres. Do you use it for maror or do you use it for karpas? If I were to ask you, you would tell me maror. Maror is a mitzvah in the Torah. It's only midrabanan nowadays, but still we have a mitzvah to eat maror. Karpas is a minhag, is something we do in order to arouse the curiosity of the children. And you know what Tosfos suggests? You eat it for karpas. It's more important to us that we elicit questions from the children than fulfilling maror. How do we explain this? How do we understand such an extreme opinion? With what the Rush said. Because I can only fulfill the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim at the optimal biblical level if I have a question. So it's more important to me to get to that biblical mandate of telling the story by having a question from the child than fulfilling the maror, which is midrabanan. Let's summarize where we are until now. What we've learned, number one, is that the Haggadah emphasizes questions all over the place, not just Manishtana. You see it in the 4 children, you see it in Rabbi Gamliel, and in 5 separate minhagim we do to elicit questions. We saw that the whole source of the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, of telling the story, emerges from questions as they're related in the Torah. And we've now demonstrated through these Rishonim and these very interesting opinions that questions represent an independent obligation. They're almost a formula that have to be included in the Seder. Your Seder has to have questions. They are an indispensable element. Now I just want to make one last observation. It's a little bit of a novel idea I saw in an article. You'll tell me if you like it or not. And that is, if you look back at the Mishnah in source number 9, the Mishnah that presents Manishtana, let me ask you a question. If you read this Mishnah carefully, who says the Manishtana in this Mishnah? It's not who you think. Read this Mishnah carefully. Mazgulo kos sheni v'kan habein shoel aviv. Right, you pour the second cup of wine, and here the child asks the father. Presumably, it's the Manishtana. But the Mishnah doesn't say that. It just says the child asks. Vim ein das baben aviv malamdo. And if the child is not able to ask, then the parent teaches him. What does he teach him? Manishtana halayla hazeh. In the Mishnah, the child does not recite the Manishtana. In the Mishnah, the original source for Manishtana, whose mouth utters the Manishtana? The parent. It's the parent that says the Manishtana, not the child. How do we understand this? Oh, you're going to tell me maybe when it says V'kan haben shoel, that's the Manishtana. And then V'mein das baben aviv malamdo. Okay, then why didn't the Mishnah say V'kan haben shoel Manishtana, V'mein das baben aviv malamdo? Why did it leave the Manishtana till the end and put it in the mouth of the parent and not the child? That's one question. And the second question is, by the way, if you think about it, the things that the child is asking about have not happened at the Seder yet. They haven't eaten matzah yet. They haven't eaten the Korban Pesach yet. Right? They haven't dipped the vegetables yet. So they haven't, at least they haven't done maror. So how is the child supposed to know to ask these questions if these things haven't happened yet? I understand this probably isn't the kid's first Seder, but still. So what do we see from this? What I'd like to argue is that Manishtana is what you teach a child in order to teach them how to ask questions. Manishtana is a lesson plan. Manishtana is the teacher's guide. It's the teacher's guide in how we teach children to ask questions. And so to me, this is very interesting because we see not only is there a distinct obligation to have questions, but the Haggadah spends time explaining to us how to teach questions. It's not just, you would think the Haggadah would be exclusively focused on asking questions and telling the story. But according to this understanding of the Mishnah, we are not just asking questions, we are also engaged in training for asking questions. That's how important the enterprise of asking questions is to the night of the Seder. Okay. So, as I said at the beginning in the intro, this class has two parts. Number one was to demonstrate the Haggadah's obsession with questions and how questions emerge as an independent obligation, an indispensable critical element to the Haggadah. What are we supposed to learn from all this? Why do we have questions playing such a prominent, outsized role in the telling of the story? So much so that we're more concerned with children asking questions than it seems to be than getting answers. So I'd like to suggest that there are four important lessons that we learn from questions and how they function at the Seder. Four important lessons. The first lesson is that questions are indispensable for the acquisition of knowledge and for forming an attachment and a personal connection to ideas. This source, this Pachad Yitzchak, some of you may know that I've used this source before because I love it and I get so much out of it. But this Pachad Yitzchak, which I'm going to read very slowly because it's very philosophical, has such a profound insight into the concept of asking questions. He's talking about the concept of maskil beginus, or mesayim b'shvach, that we tell the story beginning with the degradation and then concluding with the shvach, with the praise, with the success, with the victory. And he says, "Hine mitzvah sipur yetzias Mitzrayim chovasa hi lahaskil beginus u'lesayim b'shevach." The obligation of telling the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is to begin with the degradation and to conclude with the success, the praise. And we fulfill this by telling the story. We do this by saying that before the redemption we were servants, we were slaves, and we were idol worshippers. And the Maharal explained this in the following way. B'kasher tavin od, when you think about it some more, teda, ki hashevach shekodem lo genus, hu yoser shevach. That a success that is preceded by a failure is an even greater success, right? I'm forgetting that phrase, right? The deeper the valley, the higher the climb. That's not it. But the greater the degradation, it just only magnifies even more the success that follows it. The same way you have darkness that precedes the day. When you go from the dark to the light is more clear. Umamshichim. Now watch what he does. This is the most creative thing that Rav Hutner does. This is Pachad Yitzchak Hutner, one of the great Rosh Yeshiva thinkers of the 20th century. Umamshichim anu es hakav hala. And we extend this line of thinking further. Ki ofen hasipur shel yetzias Mitzrayim ba behat'ama letochen hasipur. That the fashion in which we tell the story parallels the content. Ki kashem shetochen hasipur mechayev l'saper es inyan hageula dafka b'tor shlemus shetzamcha mitoch hachisaron. That just like the content of the story is where we go from lack to fullness, from being low to being high. K'mochein ofan hasipur, the style, the fashion of how we tell the story, ba dafka b'toras tshuva al she'ela, comes as an answer to a question, right? Just like we go from genus to shevach, we go from being low to being high, we go from question, confusion, doubt, to answer, to clarity. Halodavar mechuverhu. It's clear to all of us. Ki kol hasaga sheniskabla lisochenu betur hatara shel sveikosenu. Anytime we learn something as an answer to our own doubts, o betur pitaro lekushiyasenu, or an answer to our questions, shivcha gadol yoser me'asherim haisa hasaga zuniklas betochenu b'derech stam. It penetrates us far more. We absorb it far more than if we were just taught something stam without any question or doubt to elicit or instigate the answer. Mibli safek v'koshi kodim la. V'chol osek v'muskalos yodea ki pa'amim harbe zakuku ateirutz le'ezrasa shel kushia. And people who study the way that we think, the way that we learn, they know that very often the question is more important than the answer. And the question is more compelling than the answer. The answer is dependent more on the question than the answer. So in other words, what I think the Pachad Yitzchak is teaching us is that questions are an indispensable tool for absorbing and internalizing ideas and establishing a connection with them. We feel far more dedicated and devoted and connected to an idea when it comes as an answer to our questions. In other words, questions, they prime us, they prepare us to internalize our most important beliefs. And so that's why they are such a critical element to the Pesach Seder, because we are studying, we are reviewing our very identity as a people. Who are we? We are the people who were redeemed by Hashem from Mitzrayim. And the way to absorb that best is as an answer to a question. I would say even further, questions invite people. Having people ask questions, invite them to engage with their own mind, their own creativity. It opens the Seder to all, no matter their background, whether they're Chacham, Rasha, Tam, or Sheinu de Elishol. And I'm so captivated this year by the Sheinu de Elishol, because I noticed this year that what do we respond to the Sheinu de Elishol? We don't tell them the story. I mentioned this in my Haggadah class. We say, At Pesachlo. We open up for him, meaning we help him to understand the question. We don't tell him the story. It's not at saper lo. We don't give him, we don't spoon feed him the answer. We open up for him because we want to invite him in. We don't want to just do it for him. We want to give him access so that he can find his own way. We open up at psachlo. There's so much attention given to questions. It's because questions are the entree, the setup, the catalyst. It's the first step to forming one's deep connection to this story, which is our whole identity. If you skip now, I'm sorry that they're not in order, but if you skip now to sources 27 and 28, a little bit off the beaten track, I think it'll expand this concept of what questions can accomplish in people engaging the story. The first source I have for you is from Cynthia Ozick, the American Jewish writer. She has an essay entitled Notes Toward Finding the Right Question. What could be a better source for this talk? And this is the beginning of this essay. The philosopher Susan K. Langer somewhere observes that every answer is concealed in the question that elicits it. and that what we must strive to do then is not look for the right answer, but attempt rather to discover the right question, right? Discovering the right question is discovering the right entry point. It's finding the core idea. And questions are what help us to accomplish this. Leon Wieselter, the Jewish American critic and editor, now unfortunately disgraced, but he wrote the following in his critically acclaimed book, Kaddish. Listen to this. Ready yourself for the study of Torah because it is not your inheritance. This is from Pirkei Avos. I have pondered this statement for years, Leon Wieselter writes. It is the most counterintuitive observation about tradition that I have found in tradition. What an estrangement it proposes. The Torah is not my inheritance? How can this be? If I was taught anything, it is that the Torah is my inheritance. We know the pasuk, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, morasha kehilas Yaakov. It is a morasha. It is an inheritance. It is a bequeathment, a bequest. Rabbi Yossi is a realist about continuity. Rabbi Yossi is the author of that statement. He cautions that in the transmission of tradition, there is a moment between the giving and the receiving, a moment when it is no longer the possession of the Father and not yet the possession of the Son, a moment of jeopardy, like the pause in a beating heart, a moment of discontinuity, a beat skipped, when what has stopped has still to start, and what has been transmitted can slip away or run out. This is the moment for which you must ready yourself. And so what he identifies is that there's this gap. There's this moment when the parent offers teaching, and then it's up to the child to absorb it. And we're not sure if that's going to happen. There has to be some sort of intervention. The child has to step up. And to me, inviting them to ask questions is what will ensure that that gap is traversed, that transmission will occur. By inviting the child in, inviting anybody in to ask their own questions, it's to ensure that the Torah becomes an inheritance. Look at how Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, go back to source number 26, how he captures this so beautifully in his writings, which were put together in a Haggadah. In what way is man's superiority over beast manifest? It would not be wrong to say man questions. Undoubtedly, the very first reaction of a newborn child to the sight of the world is, what is this? Mazos. The human spirit seeks to understand what is happening around it, and the question, what is this, arises in the child's heart even before his mouth can articulate the words. If only we could read the expression in his eyes, we could understand the query in his mind. Questioning sums up the entire nature of a child's soul, and only because his soul continues to ask incessantly does the child learn so much in his first years. And so what we're really doing when we elicit questions from the child, when we have them say the Manishtana, when we do strange things, what we are doing is really tapping into something which is innate, which is just part of our DNA, that as we grow up, we seek to learn and understand more about our world. And so questions at the Seder are meant to highlight exactly what Rabbi Hirsch, describes here. Skip with me for a second to source number 33, because Dr. Erica Brown shows us how questions are so critical to overcoming spiritual boredom. She has a book entitled Spiritual Boredom and Inspiring Spiritual Growth. Boredom occurs when we run out of questions, because it demonstrates that we have run out of interest. Combating boredom in the Jewish classroom, or any classroom for that matter, is ultimately about the stimulation of questions. Returning to the Seder table, that ancient classroom of Jewish history, we find that Maimonides encouraged us to place objects, educational props on the table, and to use the complexity of the Haggadah to make the children ask. The purpose of Passover is not to tell our children the story of Jewish peoplehood. Remember what I said before. The Mishnah doesn't prescribe a script for the children to tell the story. It is to make the evening interesting enough for them to ask questions. Telling, especially repeated telling, leads to a flat story with a dull landscape. Asking leads to exploration, further questioning, engagement, creativity. Boredom will only leave the classroom when we have done a good enough job of making the children ask. And so this is the first of what I believe are four lessons that we can learn about questions in the Seder, and that is that questions are an indispensable for the acquisition of knowledge, and invite everyone to form their own attachment, to find their own way through the story which is our identity. The second of the four lessons that I believe we learn from questions, we learn from both the Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, as well as from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who we lost this past year. Both of them demonstrate how questions play a critical role in developing faith. Questions are indispensable for faith, and one of the central themes of the Seder night is reinforcing our faith in Hashem. Take a look with me at source number 29. The form of narration in the Haggadah avails itself of dialogue. One person asks and another answers. It is necessary to dramatize this narration because God reveals himself to man if and when the latter searches for him. If one does not inquire, if one expects God to reveal himself without making an all-out effort to find him, one will never meet God. Uvikashta misham, but from there you will seek the Lord and you shall find him if you search after him with all your heart and all your soul. You can only find Hashem if you are asking questions, if you are inquiring, if you are searching. Nachmanides, in his comments on the verse, his habitation you shall seek, and there you shall come, says, you shall come to me from distant lands, and you shall keep inquiring, where is the road leading to God's habitation? The searching for the sanctuary, the curiosity to know the location of the sanctuary itself, redeeming and sanctifying, that notion of asking. Turn to the last paragraph. On the first night of Pesach, we tell the story of a long search by man for God, of God responding to the inquisitive search, of God taking man who longs for him into his embrace. At the Seder, we try to stimulate the naive curiosity of the children and thereby make them God searchers. We ask questions in order to cultivate faith. The quest for God, along with the acceptance of the commandments, is the true spiritual liberation. Take a look at Rabbi Sachs, source number 30. But questioning goes deeper than this in Judaism, so deep as to represent a sui generis religious phenomenon. The heroes of faith ask questions of God. And I wanted to put all these psukim on my source sheet, but I realized it was too much. The heroes of faith ask questions of God, and the greater the prophet, the harder the question. Abraham asked, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Moshe asked, O Lord, why have you brought trouble upon this people? Yirmiyah said, you are always righteous, O Lord. When I bring a case before you, yet I would speak with you about your justice. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease? The book of Eov, the most searching of all explorations of human suffering, is a book of questions asked by man, to which God replies with four chapters of questions of his own. Go to the next paragraph. Religious faith has often been seen by others as naive, blind, accepting. That is not the Jewish way. Judaism is not the suspension of critical intelligence. It contains no equivalent to the famous declaration of the Christian thinker Tertullian, certum est quia impossibile est. I believe it because it is impossible. To the contrary, asking a question is itself a profound expression of faith in the intelligibility of the universe and the meaningfulness of human life. And the best quote, it's not on your source sheets, I apologize, but take a look at this on the screen. Rabbi Avram Yoshua Heschel, we are closer to God when we are asking questions than when we think we have the answers. So brilliant. It's questions that draw us ever closer to pursue, to find out, to learn more about Hashem and his Torah. So the second lesson, as I said, that we learn from questions at the Seder is that questions are necessary in developing faith. Third lesson we learn from questions, and that is questions can contribute to our overall mental health. Take a look at the next source from Rabbi Dr. Abraham Tursky, who we also lost this year. The four questions emphasize yet another aspect of spirituality, the ability to live with conflict. The emphasis of modern psychology on the resolution of contention has resulted in people eschewing all conflict. Living with ongoing stress has become unthinkable. And many individuals who find themselves entangled in struggles that are not readily resolvable may attempt to escape therefrom by rather desperate methods, not least of which is seeking the oblivion or euphoria of alcohol, mind-altering substances, or diversionary activities. The loss of tolerance for conflict has had a profound impact on interpersonal relationships, as well as on the intrapersonal psyche. The unprecedented divorce rate is, to a great measure, due to the inability to withstand conflict and to seek immediate relief from all frustrating situations. Anyone who's heard even a few classes of my wife Shoshana, she talks about this all the time, being able to hold different emotions, conflicting emotions at the same time. That's what it means to be able to endure and to thrive. The four questions, returning to Rabbi Tursky, the four questions point out that the Seder, the Feast of Spirituality, is characterized by the coexistence of conflicting ideas. We eat the dry matzah, the bread of the slave, and the bitter herbs commemorate our enslavement, yet we recline on couches and dip appetizers into dressings according to the custom of the free and wealthy nobility. How can we reconcile these opposites? The answer is that we do not need to reconcile all conflicts. The concept of freedom as espoused in the Torah is quite distinct from the secular concept. According to the latter, the ultimate aim of freedom is the absence of all discord, a state rarely encountered in reality. Torah freedom includes the capacity to live with stress and to be able to achieve serenity in the face of conflict. And that's why we invite questions as questions, questions independent of answers. Because part of what it means to be a Jew, and part of it, what it means to live a healthy life, is to be able to live with questions, to live with conflicts. That is the third lesson. And finally, the fourth lesson, also from Rabbi Sachs, is that questions ensure that we do not forget some of our primary tasks in the world, which is to ask questions when there is injustice and unfairness. Source number 32. Undoubtedly, though, the most unique of Judaism's questions, and the one most associated with the prophetic tradition, is about justice. Why bad things happen to good people. Why evil seems so often to triumph. Why there is so much undeserved suffering in the world. Karl Marx once called religion the opium of the people. He believed that it reconciled them to their condition. Religion, he argued, I'm skipping a few lines, religion, he argued, was the most powerful means ever devised for keeping people in their place. It spread the aura of inevitability over arbitrary fate. So argued Marx, if the world is to be changed, religion must be abandoned. Second paragraph, nothing could be less true of Judaism, the faith born when God liberated a people from the chains of slavery. The question that echoes through the history of Judaism, from Avraham to Yirmiyah to Eov to rabbinic medrash, to medieval lament to Hasidic prayer, is not acceptance of, but a protest against injustice. There are some questions to which the response is an answer, but there are other questions to which the response is an act. To ask, why do the righteous suffer, is not to seek an explanation that will reconcile us to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. It is to turn to God with a request for action and to discover, in the very process of making the request, that God is asking the same of us. And so we see that there is a Jewish mandate to question why there is injustice, why there is evil. We must always be questioning things that we are not satisfied with in this world. And it's the Seder night that we choose to cultivate this finely honed sense of what it means to ask good questions, important questions, hard questions. So just to summarize, the four lessons that I believe we learn from the focus on questions at the Seder, again, is one, questions are indispensable for the acquisition of knowledge and forming an attachment to ideas, absorbing them, internalizing them, making them your own. Second, questions are critical in cultivating faith. Third, questions can contribute to our overall mental health. We need to learn how to live with questions, how to live with conflict. And then, as we just discussed, questions ensure that we constantly constantly protest, question why there is injustice and evil in this world. We have seen this evening, I'm just going to unshare my screen. We have seen this evening the special role that questions play at the Seder. The Seder is filled with questions from beginning to end. They are a critical, necessary, and indispensable element, and they form an independent component of the Seder in and of themselves. The ultimate goal of the Seder, as I mentioned, is to identify who we are as a people. Our identity is that we are the ones who were redeemed from Egypt, and we seek to transmit that identity and teach our children to take on this identity for themselves. This cannot be done without asking questions. In order for us and our families to remain connected and engaged, we must continue to ask questions, to promote questions, and embrace questions. One of the many impacts of the pandemic on Jewish communities is that it is compelling us to ask questions we should have been asking long ago. When we were forced to close our shul and other communal institutions for a lengthy period of time, when we were forced to remain isolated at home, these questions stepped into the spotlight. Questions such as, what role does the shul play in my life? What do I get from coming to shul? What do I contribute to the shul experience? How can we as a community take the lessons from the past year and apply them to our communal and individual life? What should we be doing differently as we continue our return to shul and communal life? What should never change? These are the questions facing us as a shul and as a community. And it's critically important that everyone ask these kinds of questions and others around their Seder tables. Even if you don't have the answers, just asking them is so important. It's the first step. It is in and of itself an engagement in shul life in the service of Hashem, just asking the questions. As we learn from Socrates and that young woman on TikTok, it sometimes takes courage to ask the difficult questions. I hope and pray we have the courage to meet the challenges that lie ahead by showing our willingness to engage these important questions. I wish you all a Chag Kosher V'Sameach, a happy and safe Pesach to you and all your families. Thank you so much for joining this evening. Chag Kosher V'Sameach. Take care, everybody.